It was January of 2020. I was in Montpellier in the south of France on my gap year. This is when we were in the early stages of the virus, as wise men call it, when it was still contained in China. I was paranoid about the virus spreading over the whole world, but I thought it was just paranoia. I would look at people on the street and wonder if they were secretly sick. A hidden monster carried in silence, spread without any parties knowing. Montpellier was also not in a good place. The Yellow Vest protests had taken over the city. I once went on a date where there was literally an explosion a block away. People looked poor and depressed. I was spending money on food faster than I was making it, and I was paranoid of running out. I walked through the Maghrebi neighborhood on my daily commute where I got into a fight, which I happily won, was pickpocketed, served rotten food, and slapped twice. The Mediterranean's chilly winters are rainy enough to be depressing, but not cold enough for the genuine snow and ice I grew up with in Pennsylvania. I strangely saw someone in a t-shirt from Franklin and Marshall College from Lancaster, PA, but they had no idea where the t-shirt came from. I say all of this, but I genuinely did love being in France in general, although those last few weeks were really depressing. I had been sick for over a week, which didn't help my ruminating, and my world had shrunk to basically the apartment I was staying at and getting food outside. I felt an ache in my body while my temperature was completely wrong. I felt like I couldn't get out of bed, which reconciled my ability to do anything except read. I had just finished reading a book on the differences in governance between the Spanish and British empires in colonial America, and how these had reflected into the futures of those societies. This was since the thing I was interested in studying at that time was the question of why America was rich while Latin America or Mexico was poor. I started to read the book The Great Wave by David Hackett Fischer when I was done with that other one. It was on my mom's recommendation, where she said it alongside his other book, Albion's Seed, was one of the most important books she had ever read. My mom was obsessed with macro-political ramifications of financial systems and was studying the history of inflation as a hobby, which got her into reading a book which most people would find intensely boring. After I started this history of inflation, I became completely entranced. I finished it within 2 days. I couldn't sleep, and it was past 2 a.m. when I finished reading The Great Wave. I was in shock. Everything I had intuitively picked up in my childhood clicked together. It was so horrifying. I then knew what was going to happen next. It was like the plot of a horror movie, in which all of the horrible things which you were seeing over the story suddenly fit together. I looked outside, and the external world perfectly mapped onto what I thought intellectually. It makes sense, but the underlying theme of why it's so terrible shakes your world. You can't unsee what you know the truth to be. I went into the shower and let the reality sink in. That night, in January of 2020, was one of the most important turning points of my life. Ironically, it was a big impetus to get me to change the direction of this channel. I started finding things in my studies of anthropology which I wanted to share with the world, and I didn't see a lot of other public figures talking about it. In my gap year, I started to learn things which I felt were genuinely worth sharing. That's why I moved away from alternate history to the current content. Let me show you the story of my journey and what I think it means for the world. As I learned more about the world and I put more work into this channel, I had to do more to protect it, and one of the best ways to protect yourself online is Incogni, the sponsor of today's video. Data brokers collect all of your private information, such as your address, birthday, online activity, and even your financial information and social security number. This information can be sold to companies and government agencies or put on public search sites that are available for anyone to look up. All of this happens without your knowledge or control. The good news is that you can request for this data to be removed. The bad news is that it could take you years to do so manually. That's where our sponsor Incogni comes in. They make the process of taking back control of your information quick and easy. Their service will work on your behalf to contact these data brokers and request the removal of your information, while keeping you informed and in the loop the whole time. You just create an account, grant Incogni the right to work for you, and sit back and watch them do the work. They'll even handle any objections for you. Incogni goes above and beyond to give you back control of your personal information. For my fans, they're offering you 60% off an annual plan for anyone who clicks the link below and uses the code WhatIfAltHist. They offer a 30-day back money guarantee, so there's no reason to not click the link and start using Incogni today. Part 1. The Road We've Walked. Our current age of history feels like a waiting room. The sort of place where you're in a doctor's office and you've been waiting for over an hour, where the front desk lady can't tell you why he's running late. You're trying to read, but the people around you are making too much noise, so you just stare at the wall listening to music, hoping you make yourself so bored that you break through to a new level of boredom where time moves faster. The difference is that instead of a doctor's appointment, the thing we're waiting for is a complete historic breaking point. A period of social collapse, wars, plague, and famine, which completely reworks history, which is less ominous than having to deal with doctors, if I'm being frank. As Lenin said, there are decades in which nothing happens and moments in which decades of history crash together. I've known about the waiting room since I was in high school. I could pick on an intuitive basis that the current order was broken. I worked as a janitor and paper pusher at my mom's brewery in high school. I talked to the other employees and picked up from their grumblings that the job market and cost of living was garbage, and not even getting better. When I was in high school, it was normal for kids to work over 13 hours a day by certain proxies. You had 8 hours of class, 3 hours of homework, and over 2 hours of sports. I saw my classmates get completely burnt out, bragging about how little sleep they got. All the adults around me said that this was to go to college and then get a job, but I knew of no one who was really getting those good jobs. I was pretty dissatisfied in high school, barely passing freshman year, although I picked up my grades over time. I could pick up intuitively everyone was screwed, but I didn't have the words to articulate it. When I was in high school, I had an intuitive sense that everything was going to fall apart. There was a period when I was 16 when I had 2 weeks of stabbing pains in my stomach, where I knew that something was wrong, but again, I couldn't articulate it. Then in 2016 to 2020 was when the world officially started to come apart. Before 2016, the technocratic elite was very good at massaging the narrative so that people believed that things weren't that bad. I remember having a conversation with my dad when I was 14. I said, "Dad, when I watch older movies and hear stories, it's clear people have gotten poorer. Almost no one today has a single man who can support a family." That was something my father had turned around in the previous year, and he said, "Yeah, Americans work longer hours in worse conditions and for less stuff." He blamed globalization predominantly. I grew up in the Rust Belt where there was deindustrialization everywhere. Wherever I went were decaying buildings, dirt, and people talking about how stuff used to be better. I was in complete shock that no one in national politics talked about deindustrialization, a process which screwed over 100 million Americans, or a population larger than basically any European country. When Trump showed up, and I gradually turned around on Trump, disliking him in 2016 and then voting for him in 2020, is that whether you like or dislike him, he's a demonstration of how the elite started to panic. Both the Republicans and Democrats had agreed to certain subconscious premises for the post-World War II era. The growth of the managerial class, not questioning the growth of cultural leftism, immigration and diversity being good, the American empire, free market, open borders, the university system for assorting the ruling class, among many other things, were all innately good. They pretended that this was a consensus that the public was behind, while the reality is that they acted like a uniparty, and when political forces which questioned this showed up, they started to vociferously attack them since it was an emperor's new clothes moment. Both his allies and enemies agree that Trump is an enemy of the establishment. Afterwards, in 2020, another domino fell, the virus being another obvious example. China closed itself off to the Western world. The Summer of Love, which is the new colloquial term for the post-George Floyd events, was a real turning point in my life, given that I saw so many people I trusted and cared about posting legitimately incredibly unhinged stuff. People were saying stuff casually like destroying property was moral, that we needed financial retransfers across races, that the entire social and economic and cultural world could only talk about leftism. Things that would legitimately destroy society were pushed, and if you were against this, you were a demon. If you were against madness, you were treated as a complete social pariah. The Summer of Love was the real trigger point for me in realizing the older order was doomed, and it was just a matter of time. I process my consciousness through music and that I think through sound. I remember in the fall of 20 thinking about how I knew that the current world I lived in would no longer exist in a few years. I knew that whatever would come next would be so strange as to be impossible to predict. I knew that I didn't know what was going to happen next. I listened to the song TikTok by Mabel and Clean Bandit as mentally symbolic to me of the current mental order and what it stood for. I saw the Japanese song Senbon Zakura as symbolic of the new coming insanity. I know that this stuff is objectively silly, but if we can't have silly stuff as the world's going to hell, what can we have? I went to college for a semester in the fall of 2020 in rural Maine, and I saw the peace around me as a false illusion of a world really on fire. The fire had already started, we just wouldn't notice since it started rupturing the foundations of the house. When I dropped out of school a semester later and moved to Mexico as the channel took off, I knew I was entering a world where anything could happen, a place where you'd have to keep your eyes open. 4 years have passed since then and I haven't been disappointed. I was accurate in predicting that what would happen would be stranger than what I could have ever predicted. I like to say that the universe has given us more warning shots that shit's out to hit the fan than we could ever ask for. The wars in Armenia, Burma, Israel, or Ukraine, President Trump being nearly assassinated twice, the change in presidential campaigns last second for the Democrats as their old leader is a dotard and a fool. China has cut itself off from the world, turning authoritarian while Russia has done the same. Brazil has turned into a pseudo-dictatorship, cutting out Twitter. Britain has turned authoritarian, cutting out dissent. Nearly every country in the world seems desperate. I ask you guys this question. If the world were to go to total hell, what would it look like? If you lived in the 50s and were writing a sci-fi novel about a dystopian world where you see mass political and social revolutions, wouldn't it look a lot like now? I joke that the world we live in is what it would look like if someone tried to write a science fiction novel about putting Blade Runner in the 1600s. You combine the godlike technology, AI, megacorporations, ability to colonize Mars, genetically engineered viruses with the witch burnings, mass inequality, proxy wars, religious wars, heresy, mercenaries, and revolutions. It's just that cyberpunk John Smith is way more badass than the reality we live in. One of my friends likes to say that society is a dystopia in which the boring Karens won and restructured the world and Western civilization in their image. We're way more lame than any dystopias like 1984, Brave New World, or The Handmaid's Tale. The ugly, monotonous gaslighting is a dystopia in its own right. I'm known for the prediction that America will start seeing blood on the streets within the next election. I say these things so you know I'm not a charlatan. I'm giving you a clear prediction with a time frame so I can be proven wrong. If I turn out to be wrong, then I will take responsibility for doing so. I wondered to myself, Rudyard, if things continue to get worse and you know a war is coming, how will you deal with it? The short answer is that after a long period of grieving and coming to terms with this reality, I'm largely chilling now. Anticipation is often worse than the suffering itself. This was a long story to convey the point that so far I feel vindicated from the idea I had at the start of this story, that 4 years ago I sensed that the Great Wave was about to crash. The events of the last 4 years have behaved in a manner realistic to how I would have written a timeline where the Great Wave is about to crash. I'm sitting on the porch looking at the shore, waiting to see the tide pull back beyond the point where it should. The birds aren't singing anymore and the animals aren't burrowing. I could still be wrong and accept that. Now I'm going to stop leaving you all in anticipation. What is the Great Wave? Part 2. The Great Wave. The first author who teased out the Great Wave was Fernand Broudel. Fernand Broudel is an important enough author in himself that I should probably give some backstory just for cultural literacy. He's possibly the most influential historian of the 20th century. He fits in with that era's obsession, driven by Marxist underlying principles for economic data and statistics, as opposed to the 19th century's epic great man history. After the 1960s, writing writing grand narratives became taboo and historians had to study the economic condition of women weavers of 14th century Ghent. Fernand Braudel started out that trend, but it was based when he did it. Fernand Braudel was a French dissident who was captured by the Nazis. He wrote his 2,000-page masterpiece on the society of the Mediterranean in the late 16th century in his head in a Nazi work camp. Fernand Braudel's thing was daily life and the cost of living. He would have his grad students read thousands of letters and primary sources to compile the prices of essentials across world history to get the best data on the price of everything everywhere in every year. Fernand Braudel was practically worshipped as a god in the field of history for the second half of the 20th century. When I was in Marseille, which is one of the worst cities I ever seen in the world, in their Museum of History, there was an entire wing of the museum dedicated to him. His best book, in my opinion, was A History of Civilizations, which I use all the time for my studies of global society. His book on daily life in the early modern period is also very useful. I read The Soul of France. That book's hilarious. I was reading it to actually get a good read on the anthropology of France. I did get some of that, but the book is really his bizarre tangents thrown together. He literally has an entire chapter on how the roof structures of France are symbolic for its culture, and it doesn't even make sense in the context he writes it. I don't remember the cultural fault lines he was talking about at all. With all the authors of the 19th and 20th centuries, I always wish their editors beat them more into halving the length of their books. This is why I make 40-minute video essays and not books, to partly hold myself accountable to brevity, and it's also just a better business model. That era of French academia is actually one of my top sources on everything, with authors like Amaury de Riencourt, Todd Emanuel, Fernand Braudel, Bertrand de Juvenal, amongst others, being some of the most influential thinkers of my worldview. However, French academia in that era was tainted by Marxist influence, in which they were obsessed with the means of production and viewed equality as something that naturally exists in the world, which it doesn't. I'm really glad academia went through this phase of obsession with economic data, since I use it for my own personal data mining for my theories. However, academia's myopia on tiny details left the human sciences completely without grand narratives which could explain the world. This has led to a meaning crisis in which the public has no idea what to believe or how to orient themselves in the world. It also allows the patent absurdities which we believe as a society, like printing infinite money, won't have consequences, or that a man can be a woman. Watch this channel's latest video if you want to hear more about academia's great lie in the 20th century. However, from all of this, Fernand Braudel noticed that there were rhythmic inflation patterns over history. These were all very closely correlated with revolutions. He noticed that the Western world experienced revolutions roughly every 250 years. Examples of this were the French Revolution or the revolutions of 1848. Before then, the religious wars which rocked across Europe in the 1600s, which killed a third of the continent's population. Before then, the Black Death, which killed half of Eurasia's population. Fernand Braudel made a passing remark to this, saying that there was a clear correlation here that he didn't have the time or energy to get into, in which he said that at the start of the 21st century, he would expect this pattern to see another wave of conflicts like this. The irony is that a bunch of different authors predicted the same thing. One of the worst written books I've read in my life was Long Cycles by Goldstein. For so much of academic writing, I want to scream at the author, write this like you're talking to a human being, since a human being is going to have to read this. Goldstein predicted in the 70s from economic data relating to military spending that America would have a major war around the 2020s. His idea, something I've seen elsewhere, is that countries, once they have too much military spending, it predicts their imperial collapse. From the generational cycles that Strauss and Howe push, writing in the 90s, they said America would have a political crisis equal to the Revolution, Civil War, or the World Wars in the 2020s. Spengler, around World War I, said in a century that the West would face decline, Caesarism, civil wars, nihilism, and other parallels to the fall of the Roman Republic. This is a theme a lot of very brilliant writers agree with. David Hackett Fischer, one of my favorite writers as I said earlier, dug into this even more deeply. He looked at the line Braudel wrote in the 60s and 70s, and DHF wrote The Great Wave in the 90s. The Great Wave is one of the best history or economics books I've ever read. DHF is a very clear writer, and it's only like 200 pages, and thus I was able to read it in 2 days. The book covers 1,000 years of Western history from the Crusades until the present. This pattern is that there are periods of price stability and others with inflation. These alternate. The 20th century was a period of inflation, the most rapid in human history by a pretty significant margin. The 19th century was deflation, or the value of money going down. The second half of the 18th century was inflation, while the era of Louis XIV was deflation. From the discovery of the New World until the 30 Years' War, 1500 to 1650 was mass inflation. The Renaissance from 1400 to 1500 was deflation. Then the period from the Crusades to the Black Death was inflation. This came after a period of deflation with the Dark Ages. The correlation between population growth is incredibly strong here. In the periods of deflation, you saw population stagnation. This is something we don't think about given we assume progress is innate and always has to happen, but there are significant eras of history, even in modernity, which see population collapse. This is important for us to notice since we're going to be in one of those eras. As recently as the 17th century, most countries in Western Europe saw their populations collapse by 1/3, which is roughly what we think the number for the global population was. Europe in the 15th century had half the population it did in the 14th. The exception to this correlation between population growth and inflation is the 19th century, where from the period between the American Revolution and World War I saw very little inflation while the world's population skyrocketed since it also saw the Industrial Revolution. You see, inflation isn't a pure proxy for population growth. It's really resource scarcity per person. Thus, the 19th century saw productivity gains that were rapid enough to offset the population growth, which through equilibrium attained a result like population stagnation. We also see the principle that population growth drives inflation since after World War I, there was a concerted effort by the Western governments to move back onto a gold standard and get rid of said inflation. This is something that horribly backfired in that the gold standard hobbled their economies from growing. Every major regime of the 20th century realized that the maintenance of a gold standard was strategically impossible in an ecosystem growing that fast. This is since in a population that's growing, you need to increase the money supply in order to create a proxy for the whole scale of the ecosystem's growth. It's similar to how when the US's population expanded from 6 million at the time of the American War for Independence to 300 million today, the ratio of senators or congressional representatives per person balloons due to the ecosystem expanding so rapidly. DHF consistently found a series of patterns. One is that for the economies with stagnating populations, you saw stagnating real estate, social stability, low inequality, and rationalistic ideologies. Examples of this include the Victorian era, the Enlightenment, and the Renaissance. Those historic eras come with certain emotional connotations for reasons. Meanwhile, the eras of increasing inflation saw the opposite trends. On the positive side, these tended to be eras of growing commercialization, literacy, culture, and complexity. On the other side, they ended in horrifying crises like the Black Death, the 30 Years' War, and the French Revolution. However, in order to explain this, let's get to another author who was able to create a mathematical system to explain the causal mechanism that this works through, which in turn was able to predict these crises. Part 3. Secular Cycles. Peter Turchin is a Russian historian and data scientist based out of Connecticut. I've spoken briefly with both thinkers. He took DHF's ideas and took them to a whole other level. DHF does a great job, and he also predicted a crisis like this in the 21st century. However, DHF did not have the computational ability Turchin has to actually explain why these happen. Turchin calls these secular cycles, and he's able to predict them in advance with 3 variables, those being income inequality, competition for elite jobs, and average wages. He is able to plug those 3 variables in to predict over a dozen crises over history to the exact years they took place in. His book Secular Cycles is great. He uses this to predict the crises we talked about DHF talking about earlier, as well as the fall of the Roman Republic or Empire, the collapse of Chinese dynasties, and the Russian Revolution. It's a constant historic pattern that societies don't skip. This is normal to history and goes back as far as we have records. We We even see these same patterns inside the animal kingdom. A natural Malthusian cycle of overpopulation causing mass death, so the population crashes and it restarts. I saw this happen to the deer where I was growing up in rural PA. We had way too many of them, and then they started having deer plagues and famines as they ate up the whole forest before their population crashed. When I was growing up, there were 20 million deer in the state of Pennsylvania and 13 million people, so it was sheer overpopulation. Turchin in 2010 said from all the economic data he was looking at that America would face this sort of crisis in the 2020s. He was confident enough, he wrote a whole book on this called The Ages of Discord, where he uses a variety of different metrics between average height, family formation, employment, average wages, cost of living, and stuff as odd as average age of marriage or sleep time to create proxies for what he calls the misery index. He wrote at the time that the quality of life for the average American had gotten worse exponentially and would keep crashing. I found personally from looking at the historic and anthropological data that when the average age of marriage gets above 28, you're going to have a major war historically. We're at past age 30 now. This is since humans are animals first and rational later. Thus, when mating gets too difficult, we burn society down in order to get a better shot. This makes sense in retrospect, and the idea that our society denies this, once you think about it, is legitimately insane. The idea of historic cycles of the rise and fall of states, driven off certain patterns, is something historic authors like Ibn Khaldun, Simochian, Machiavelli, Herodotus, Aristotle, or Polybius talk about. This was just widely acknowledged to be completely correct over history. Our society's main argument against it is, but it's different this time. When you press people, they tend to not really have an argument for why it's actually different this time. We're disagreeing with thousands of years of history because the vibe isn't right. However, historically, these cycles always hit roughly every 250 years. With Turchin, the way this works is that, as Aristotle said, everything naturally creates its own end. Thus, an era of peace naturally results in a growth of the population. As the population increases, the leverage of the average worker decreases. When you have more workers competing for the same job, wages get worse. What this in turn means is that inequality skyrockets as this leverage gets taken in by capital. Our era of history is one of the most extreme examples of this, in which the world in general went from one of the lowest rates of inequality ever after World War II to one of the highest ever in history now. It's crazy that this happened in the background without people noticing, but it's one of the fastest, biggest, and most important economic changes ever in human history. Inequality raises the water for everyone. As inequality increases, it pushes most people into de facto poverty. This is something that's very clear today, in which 2/3 of Americans can't pay a $1,000 emergency fee and 40% can't pay $400. When people get poorer, they also get more radicalized and desperate. I like to say you don't really know who you are as a person until you've seen yourself hungry or in physical pain. The person who you thought was this nice kid in high school will decapitate a Chinese peasant with a katana in a different society with different incentives. Inequality, or having a few very good slots and most people stuck in poverty, creates perverse incentives. If the end point is whether or not you get to pass on your genes or survive, then becoming violent is a rationally correct biological endpoint to reach. The post-World War II era of history saw violence as innately stupid, which just made me realize that that era of history was so complacent as to never realize that there are points in human life desperate, dramatic, and horrible enough that violence is the logical conclusion. But that's most of human history. Turchin talks about this whole demographic called elite aspirants. These are the kinds of people in our society who get multiple degrees at college or are trying to get their startup to work. In a previous society, they'd be happy to work at the factory or as a local manager at a supermarket because that would make enough money that they could support a family comfortably and go on vacation. However, they're forced by inequality into being more ambitious. Revolutions are never driven by the poor, but by these groups of elite aspirants. Even the Russian or French revolutions, which were supposedly revolutions by the poor, were really driven by the clever middle class. Over history, you'll consistently find the public split into different interest groups based off someone's underlying class, social, ethnic, or regional interests. The optimates versus the populares in the fall of the Roman Republic, the Armagnacs versus Burgundians in the French Hundred Years' War, the parliamentarians versus royalists in the British Civil War, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, Empire or the Taipings versus Imperials in mid-19th century China. Read this text wall to see what underlying class or ethnic differences these warring factions belied. Before these crises, you see a society in which most people, even the supposed upper class, are living close to poverty, while there are a few who are staggeringly wealthy. This then results in horrifying political polarization, with both sides that basically want to kill the other. You see the skyrocketing of crime, the price of everything going through the roof due to inflation. The thing that tipped off DHF on this whole process was that governments before these crises always overprint money since the elites are weak and desperate. Printing money is the easy way out for governments to keep doing this. This catches the society in a horrible trap in which the government prints money to cover their ass, and then this results in the cost of living going up for normal people whom inflation hits the hardest. This makes the government more desperate and the cycle keeps going. Two of the ticks I didn't see in 2020 which made me question the Great Wave is firstly that the inflation wasn't that bad then. We've since solved that. Secondly, before these crises, the cost of living skyrockets. Stuff like rent, the price of food, or oil goes through the roof. The public has to be pushed into abject poverty before they rebel. Again, you could say that we solved that too. One of the scariest things I look at is that the average American picked up savings during the virus, which they've since spent. The average American is careening very close to bankruptcy right before the election. Doesn't that freak anyone else out? When we look at these crises, the number one thing which results in the nation hitting a tipping point is a budget crisis. Examples of wars starting like this are the French Revolution, France's civil wars in the 16th and 14th century, or the English Civil War. In each case, the state's debts get so enormous that they can't be repaid. One side says screw it when the other side wants to keep growing the debt. This then causes the state to split apart when the other side wants to keep growing the debt. This then causes the state to split apart into two factions, which each claim to be the true government since they don't condone the other side's government. The second issue is a transfer of power, like an election or the death of a monarch. Foreign war is historically the third, in which some geopolitical crisis forces the nation to have a major war, which one side doesn't condone. They start a civil war to avoid that. I'm so glad none of those situations apply to us now. We're so blessed. Part 4. The Crisis of the 21st Century. 4 years ago, I made a video called The Crisis of the 21st Century, where I suggested that the 21st century will experience a global crisis equivalent to those which occurred in the 19th, 17th, and 14th centuries. I still stand by that thesis. For each of those, the world collapsed into plagues, famine, and war as the global population crashed. One of the strangest historic trends that people rarely talk about is how incredibly common it is for societies on the other side of the world to be experiencing very similar things at the same time. This is such a huge rabbit hole that I can't get into here and probably deserves a video, but at this point I've promised hundreds of videos. But Victor Lieberman does a good job of covering this in his book on how you can closely correlate political development in Southeast Asia with Western Europe, which he later expands in his sequel to All of Eurasia. In the 17th century, almost every country in the world was experiencing a major political crisis in the year 1645. Germany was fighting in the 30 Years' War, a war which consumed every major country in Central Europe, killing 1/3 of its population. In areas like where my ancestors came from in Swabia, they lost 3/4 of their population. Portugal was in rebellion, and Spain, Britain, and France in civil wars. Poland was about to experience the deluge, and Russia had just pulled out of the time of troubles. The Turkish Empire, which dominated most of the Muslim world, was losing 1/3 of its population in plague, famine, and civil war. China was experiencing the fall of the Ming Dynasty, which again killed 1/3 of its population. Let's go back again into the 14th century. In the year 1348, when the Black Death was striking Europe, killing half of Eurasia's total population, England and France were in the midst of the 100 Years' War. France had 1/3 of the population it started the 100 Years' War with at its end due to a combination of war with the English, civil war, peasant uprising, and plague. The Holy Roman Empire was in a period called the Anarchy, while Italy was consumed by the conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Turks were butchering their way across the Balkans as Tamerlane was about to nuke Inner Asia. Central Asia went from one of the wealthiest places in the world to a backwater. China was experiencing one of its bloodiest wars ever as the native Chinese rebelled against the Mongol monarchy, losing half of the country's population population at least. If we want to go back even more recently, the crisis of the 19th century is one that broke out sporadically across the world in a different time frame, with manifesting in Eastern Europe with World War I, in Western Europe with France and the Napoleonic revolutions, and you can see little details, or not so little, where the famine of 1876 killed over 70 million people, or more than World War II, due to famine in Brazil, India, China, and Africa. In the mid-19th century, China had the third bloodiest war in history, killing over 20 million people, called the Taiping Rebellion. So this can happen incredibly recently, although the crisis of the 19th century was offset by the Industrial Revolution, even though I think we're way past that point for our society, where this crisis has to hit because everything that would lead up to it is already at its worst point. We can see here that global politics is in a closer sync than I think most people would believe. This is something that goes back pretty far. The Axial Age occurred at the same time, where Lao Tzu, Confucius, Buddha, and Socrates lived around 500 BC, when the major Eurasian civilizations saw a philosophic or religious breakthrough at the same time. The Roman Empire fell at the same time as the Han Dynasty, with the Trans-Eurasian Dark Age. The Bronze Age Dark Age also occurred at the same time across Eurasia, with civilizational collapses around 1100 BC in Greece, the Middle East, India, and China at the same time. While we look at the world today, we can see a planet where the Great Wave is about to crash. We can see political chaos and desperation in China, Russia, Europe, America, Brazil, or South Africa. I was watching documentaries about employment and found that in South Korea, China, Malaysia, Europe, Japan, Russia, America, and Canada had all made documentaries in the last year about the employment and cost of living crisis. In each documentary, the tone was desperate, where they were talking about how young people were completely screwed, and if the state media is saying that, you know it's really bad. The whole planet is living through an enormous crisis at the same time now. The same trends Turchin sees in America are in play across the world in different forms. It should be interesting to see how the same underlying trends can manifest across the planet. What we see with these crises is that they're staggered over a 70-year period. For example, having the French Revolution in 1790 and 1850, Russia having revolutions in 1920 and 1990, England in 1420 and 1490, Rome in 100 BC and 30 BC. What this suggests is that America will have a civil war in the 2020s, and then another one by the end of this century. It should be interesting to see what the politics look like a century from now. I hope I live to see that long, but also I don't want to be responsible for dealing with it. Can't a man die in peace? This is pretty daunting, but at the same time, why not live through some madness? When we watch movies, they're about insane situations like ours. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, or anything else you find exciting is set in insane times like this. Keep in mind, only 1/3 of the population dies consistently, which suggests there's a 2/3 chance you survive, which isn't that bad, not gonna lie. You guys tend to be smart young men. That's one of the better demographics to survive in. My family has pretty good records of what my ancestors were doing pretty far back. I've heard that's a Celtic thing, but I know what they were doing during the US Civil War, some in the Revolution, and we even traced an ancestor with William the Conqueror, who was the Lord of Dol de Bretagne. And I've been reading through notes and letters they were writing, and it's shocking to see these normal people just get stuck up in the grinding wheel of the change of history. And I thought to myself as a kid, it would be cool if I had to live through one of these crises and my descendants read my journal, and now I get to see it. The historian Barbara Tuchman said that when we read about the Middle Ages and read about the wars, plague, and horror, we compress 70 years into a single period to think that there was constant death and destruction. The reality is that we forget the timescale. World War II was only 80 years ago, but it feels like it's forever. I mentally shove World War II in with the Napoleonic Wars in my mental model. I've read lots of biographies of figures who lived through these terrible events and still had amazing lives. To look to the 17th century, there's Tycho Brahe, Galileo, Spinoza, or Leibniz just as intellectual figures. Look at how Napoleon or Julius Caesar co-opted these crises for their own personal greatness. You were born for greatness, not to be a wagey. Take the greatness if it's given to you. You know, it's better than dying. I can tell we're gonna have fun already. You here for the ride?